Google Docs is incredible, but did you know you can actually build out your own custom Google Docs? As you can see on the right here, I have the actual Google Docs, and on the left, I have our own version of Google Docs. And the best part is we can have two different instances of this open on different computers. We change one, you can see that it changes on the other. And the great part is this is actually saving, so when I refresh my page, it's being saved in a database on the server, so we always have access to this. We're going to be building this out using tools such as React, MongoDB, Socket.io, React Router, and so much more, so I can't wait to show you how to do this. If you're building any projects, then you're definitely going to need some form of hosting, and today's video sponsor, Hostinger, is one of the best options for hosting because they have tons of affordable plans that start as low as $1 a month. That is unbeatable anywhere else. On top of that, they have great cPanel support, WordPress support, VPS support, and even shared hosting options that you can use, so you can really fine-tune exactly what you need, so you can get the cheapest option you need that fits all the needs that you have. On top of that, they have great customer support, and if you use the code WebDevSimplified, all one word, that's going to give you 10% off any of their yearly plans. So if you're interested in learning more, make sure you use the link down in the description below to check out Hostinger. Welcome back to WebDevSimplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now to get started, I essentially want to explain how this application is going to work and all the pieces we're going to fit it together. That way you understand exactly what the code is going to do when we write it. So the very first thing we need to understand is how this application works. Right now we're on a document with this GUID at the top here. You can see we're at /documents, and then we have an ID for our document. Well, if we just load up our page without any ID at all, we just go to localhost 3000 or whatever our URL is, you're going to see it automatically redirects us to a completely blank document with this URL here. Now, if we want, we can make some changes into here, put some text, maybe we're going to bold part of it, let's put some italicized on part of it, and this is actually going to save these changes to the server, so that way when I refresh, you can see that I have the exact same content on our page, and anytime that you navigate to this URL, you're always going to get that exact same page rendered. But if we go here back to our home page, we're going to get a completely new blank URL. So it's an easy way for us to be able to have unique IDs, and all of this is saved in a database on the backend, which we're going to use MongoDB for. For this text editor, we're going to be using an editor called Quill. And the reason I chose Quill is because it is fully featured. It has all these features, as you can see down here, that you would want in a Google Docs style text editor. But it has this really important concept called delta. And these deltas are essentially operations that you can perform to get from one step to the next step. So in my application, if I type out some text like this, there's going to be a delta that says, okay, insert this character, and so on. So every single time I make a change, it'll tell me where that change occurs and what the change is. That way, if two people are modifying the same document, they can actually coincide by each other and have the different deltas take place. So if I type some text here and someone else is working way down here and types text, it doesn't matter if we make those changes at the exact same time, because since it's saving these deltas instead of saving the entire document, it'll know to insert this text down here on mine and insert the text I typed up here onto the other person's without overwriting any changes. This is a really powerful feature and the main reason I chose Quill for this. Now, in order to communicate back and forth, we're going to use Socket.io, super standard library for WebSocket integrations, which will make it really easy to do real-time connections between our client and our server. And speaking of client server, that's what we're going to have. We're going to have a server folder with all of our server information and a clients folder with all of our client information. And to get started, we're actually going to be using a React application. So I just ran npx create React app. And this is the boilerplate React code right here inside of this client folder. So nothing out of the ordinary there. And what we want to do is actually build out this entire application. And the first place I'm going to start is actually with the client, because we want to get a shell of our document up and running. That way we can actually start making changes, saving them to our server, and so on. So in order to do that, let's just close out of this working version of our app and try to open up the new version. So we can just say, come in here, npm start, and it's going to start up our application. And as you can see, we're inside this client folder. Make sure that's important. You're in the client folder, run npm start, and it's going to run up your application. If we give it a second to load here, we should see our application starting, and it'll just give us this boilerplate React render right here. Now, in order to make working with our application a little easier, let's go into the source here. Let's remove these CSS files and test files that we don't need. Get rid of all of this stuff, so we're just left with an index and an app. And then in our index, make sure we get rid of our CSS and all of this extra code that's not dealing with rendering. And then in our app.js, same thing, get rid of this logo, get rid of the CSS. And inside of here, let's just log out something like hi. Now, if we save, we should see that if we just give this quick refresh, we have the text hi showing up. Now, since the most important part of this application is the text editor, that's the very first thing that I want to do, and we're using Quill. So if we just go into that client folder, we can say npm i quill. That's going to download this library for us to actually get started with. And to make our life a little easier, I'm actually going to create a new component. I'm going to call this component here text editor. This is just going to be all the code for our text editor portion. And I have a nice little extension installed, and this is just called React GraphQL. Here it is, ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. It allows me to just type RFC to get a React function component just like this. And now we can put all of our code for our text editor in here. I'm just going to type the text editor. And then in our app, let's just make sure that we import that and use it. So we're going to say import text editor from /text editor. And let's just return that right here. Oops, let me just make that self-closing since we don't need to put anything in it. And now we have the text editor right there, just like we want. So the next step for us is going to be implementing Quill inside of here. And if we go to the quick start guide for Quill, you can see that the first thing they're doing is they're including a style sheet for the actual theme they want. In their case, they're using the snow theme, which is the same theme we're going to use. So we're going to make sure we include that style sheet. Luckily, when we install Quill, it comes with the style sheet. So we can just import that. And this style sheet is at quill/dist/quill.snow.css. This is the style sheet we want to install for that snow theme that we're going to be using. And then while we're at it, we're going to import Quill as well from that Quill library, just like that. So now we can actually use Quill. But the annoying thing about Quill is this is not really a React component per se. We actually need to make this work with React, so we have to do a little bit of working on our end. As you can see, to create a new Quill instance, we just call new Quill. We pass it here a selector, or we can just pass it an element, and then it's going to be some options after that, and it'll create a new text editor at that location. So let's just come in here. We're going to have a div. And for now, let's just give this here an ID that says container, just like that. We can get rid of all the text inside of it. And then we're going to create a new instance of Quill. But we only ever want to do this once when we actually render our page. So we're going to make sure we put that in a use effect. And this use effect, we only want to ever render one time. So we're going to put in these brackets here. That way it's only going to render the first time this component mounts. Then what we can do is just say new Quill. Make sure we have new here. And this new Quill is going to take in a selector, which in our case is that container ID. And then it has a theme, which in our case is the snow theme. And now if we just save this right here, go back to our application, we're of course getting this saying that use effect is not imported. So let's import use effect. Now, as you can see, we actually have a text editor being rendered out to us. A really basic text editor. We can put some text in it. As you can see, we can do bolding, but we have a very basic text editor. Now, a really important thing about React is when you set up these types of use effects like this, you want to be able to make sure you can clean up all of your code. So if I just do a few saves here, I just put some new code in here and I click save, it's going to re-render our app. It's starting to add more and more toolbars, and that's because we're not cleaning up our old toolbars, and this is something that we need to make sure we do. So if we just inspect our page to see what's going on here, we can actually see why this is working. We go over to our elements. You can see that inside of our root, we have our container, which is what we created our text editor in, and then there's all of our text editor stuff. But outside of that, we also have these toolbars here that are being added. So we need to make sure that we wrap all of this inside of one container so we can just remove it all whenever our use effect ends. And this will make sure that we clean up these toolbars so we don't actually have multiple of them at the same time. So instead, what I want to do here is make it so that we put our editor inside this container. So this container, we're going to have some kind of ref to reference it. We're just going to call this our wrapper ref. Up here, we can just say const wrapper ref equals use ref, just like that, and make sure we import use ref. And if you're unfamiliar with how use ref works, I have an entire video covering it. I'll link up with the cards and the description for you. So with our wrapper ref now, what we can do is we can essentially say that we want to be able to access this element, and we can create new elements. So what I want to do is say const editor equals, I want to say document.create element, and I just want to create a random div. And this editor right here is what we're going to pass to new Quill. So now what's happening is Quill is actually being instantiated on this editor object. And we can put that editor inside of our wrapper. So we can say wrapper ref.current to get the current instance, which in our case is this div right here. And all we want to do is we want to append our editor into there. And then what's going to happen when our Quill is created is actually going to put it all inside this container, including the actual toolbars. So let's just save, and we're going to refresh here actually, so we get a fresh look at what this is. We go to inspect. And you can see for our elements now, we have our container, and our toolbar is inside of that container, and so is our editor right here, this QL container. So what we can do is we can just clear out everything inside of our container every time that our use effect runs. So in our cleanup, in our return here, what we can say is all we want to do is take our wrapper ref, we're going to take the inner HTML, HTML, and set it to an empty string. This will clear everything out. And now you'll notice, if I just refresh our page here, and I make some changes and save, that we're getting an error. And this error is because when you use effect, it'll sometimes occur before all of your refs are properly set. And this is a big problem with useEffect that most people don't actually realize. Technically, this code is correct and it's going to solve our problem, but sometimes this wrapper ref is just not defined yet. So in order to ensure your wrapper ref is always defined, we can actually use a callback instead. We're going to replace this useEffect with a use callback, and this use callback is going to have our wrapper inside of it. It's going to be passed to our use callback. And this we're going to set equal to our wrapper ref, equal to our use callback. And we can get rid of our use ref up here. So essentially what we've done is we're saying, hey, we have this use callback function, and we're going to be passing it to our ref here. And what happens is as soon as this element gets rendered on our page, it's going to call our callback and pass that element to our callback function. So now we know that our wrapper inside of here is always defined. So we can say that our wrapper is where we're going to append things, but inside of a use callback, we don't have this return style cleanup. So what you want to do at the very top is you want to just say, hey, we're going to set the inner HTML equal to an empty string, because every time that we run this, we want to set this to an empty string to reset all of our code. And again, we're just going to do a quick check up here to make sure we have a wrapper. Otherwise, we're going to return. So if our wrapper is null, we're going to return if for some reason it does not exist, like this is not on our page yet. So now if we get rid of this return down here and we save, give it a quick refresh, you can see use callback is not being defined. So let's make sure we come up here with use callback. And now you can see we have our editor. If we make some changes and save, you can see it doesn't render out multiple toolbars. We can come in here with even more changes, click save. You can see again, not multiple toolbars are showing up, which is exactly what we want. So now with that done, we've pretty much covered all of the HTML on our page. So the next thing I want to do is actually add some styles. I'm just going to come in here, create a styles.css. I'm just going to import that into our index here. So we'll just say import.styles.css. So now we can actually start creating some CSS styles. And as always, the very first style I like to do is just to set up my box sizing on all elements before and after, just like this. And we can say box sizing is equal to border box. It just makes widths and heights so much easier to work with. Now the next thing that I want to do is take our body and I want to give it kind of this off color background color that Google Docs has. So we can just say background color here is going to be F3, 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 just like that. It's kind of this really lightish gray color. And as you can see, we now kind of have that off-colored, very light grayish color showing up. We can also get rid of the margin on our body since we don't want that. As you can see now, everything's being pushed up to the edges. This clearly doesn't look very good, so the next thing I want to work on is the actual styles for our text editor, and I want it to look like a piece of paper, essentially, a piece of paper that you'd print off. So we want to get our container, and we want to get the editor inside of it. And if we just inspect here to see what classes our editor has, you can see our editor has this QL editor class being applied to it, which is what we're going to actually overwrite. So we can say QL editor, and for the QL editor, what we want to do is set the width to be 8.5 inches. And this is because this is the size of a piece of paper. And we're going to set the minimum height here to 11 inches because that's the height of a piece of paper. And now if we save this, we're now going to have an 8 by 5 inch and 11 inch high editor here, but we need to do a little bit more to make it actually show up on our screen and look good. So the next thing I want to do is add in some padding of 1 inch. That's because we're going to have 1 inch margins on our page. This is pretty standard what you would have inside of Google Docs. So our actual page is going to be 6.5 inches wide and it's going to be 9 inches tall because of this 1 inch padding on all sides. Also, to push it out from the edge of the page, let's do one REM around our editor to give it a little bit of space. And what we want to do inside of here is add a little bit of a box shadow to give us a nice little floating effect. This is something that Google Docs does. So we're going to do 0 pixels offset on the X and Y. We're going to do 5 pixels here, 0 pixels here. And we're just going to have this be a really kind of darkish black color. So we're going to do 0, 0, 0 and 0.5 for the opacity. So it's not too harsh of a color. Then finally, we want our paper to be white. So we're going to set the background color to white. Now the only thing we have to do is go into our text editor here. Instead of having this be an ID, we're going to change this to a class name so we can actually select it. As you can see now, our paper is 8.5 inches wide and it's 11 inches tall, as you can see here by these different borders that are showing up. And the next thing I want to style is to actually make it so this is centered on our page. So if we just do another inspect here, we can see that we have this QL container class that is dictating all of our different styles. And also it has a border that's going around it. As you can see, we kind of have this border around it. It's really hard to see, but it's just this faint little line here. We want to obviously remove that border and fix up our container to make it so everything is centered. So we can just say .container.ql container. And this is also QL Snow because that's the theme that we're using. So we're going to have all these different classes. And all we want to do is remove that border. So we'll say border none. And immediately if we save that, it got rid of the border that was down here at the bottom, kind of annoying. Next thing we want to do is display of flex. And we're just going to justify our content in the center. And that's going to line this page up in the very center for us. Now, the final thing I want to tackle is this toolbar up here. I want it to actually look a little better. And when I scroll down, I want it to follow me on the page instead of always being at the top. That way I can always access it. So let's get our container and let's look at the class for our toolbar. If we inspect here, you can see we have QL toolbar and QL snow. So we can just come in here, QL toolbar, and we can do QL snow if we really want. And all we want to do inside of here is display, flex. We're going to justify the content in the center, and we want to set a position of sticky here. So what this is going to do is it's going to center it, and it's going to make it so it's stuck to the top. And to make sure it's stuck to the top, we're going to set our top to 0. So now when I scroll, you can see that it's scrolling down with me, but it needs to be in front of our editor. To make sure it shows up in front of our editor, let's set the z index to 1. And now when I scroll, you can see it shows up in front of our editor, but right now it has no background color. So let's give it our own background color. We can come in here, we can say background color, and we're going to use that exact same F3 color as the background. And now when we scroll, you can see it shows up over top with that background color. Looks a lot better. I also want to, instead of have a sharp border on it, I'm going to get rid of that and replace it with a box shadow. And we're going to use the exact same box shadow that we used before. So I'm just going to paste that down so we have a nice little shadow on the bottom of this that looks pretty nice. And that's pretty much all the styles we need for our actual editor. But one thing that's really important about Google Docs is that you can easily print it. And if we come in, right click to print this, and we just click print, you're going to notice the printed document has our toolbar at the top. It has all these edges. We want to get rid of all of that. This should show up exactly on one page. So let's just write out some text inside of here. We'll have a few lines. Just get a little bit of text. We're even going to make this one expand so it spans across multiple lines, just so we can see if this looks exactly as it should. And in order to do print specific styles, we can say media, print, and this is going to allow us to do print specific styles that only show up on our printing of the page. And if you're confused by this media syntax, I have an entire video covering it. I'll link in the cards and description below. So the first thing we want to do is make our body have no background. So we're going to say background color is going to be none. Let's just make background none. That way there's definitely no background at all. Get rid of that nice background color. Next thing we want to do is we want to take our editor and we want to change it just a little bit. We'll say QL editor, just like this. And if you remember, I said we have this 1-inch margin on all sides, which means our actual width is really more like 6.5 inches. So we want to make sure that when we print, our width is going to be 6.5 inches. And same thing with our height. We want to make sure that this is 9 inches. And that's just because we're taking up 1 inch of margin on all different sides. And in order to dictate that margin, we have this really cool CSS selector called page. And this is going to dictate things on the actual page when you print it. So we can say we want to have 1-inch margins right here. We can say margin 1 inch. And that'll make our page have 1-inch margins. There's not very many selectors you can use in page, but margin is one of them. But that means we need to get rid of our hard-coded margins inside of our container, which we set on our padding and our margin. So let's get rid of those, set them to 0. And that way the only thing dictating our size is this margin here and the width and height right here of our actual element. Lastly, all I want to do is get rid of that box shadow. So we're going to say box shadow none. And I want to make sure that we align this in the front. So we can say flex start. That way we don't have to worry about any flexbox centering doing any weird things. And then finally, we want to hide pretty much everything else. And the only thing else on our page is our toolbar. So we're going to make sure our toolbar is hidden. So we're going to say display of none. Now, if we save this and now we try to print, you'll notice that our text shows up almost like it should, but we still have our toolbar showing up here. So if we just cancel this real quick, let's just get rid of this selector here to make sure it's any toolbar inside of our container. See if that fixes the issue. Come over here, print, and that didn't quite fix the issue. We're just going to do a quick refresh. I'll copy all this text, paste in there, make sure we didn't have any ghost stuff showing up before. Do a print, it's still showing up. So then pretty much the only other thing to say is if we look up here, you can see that we have this QL toolbar QL snow, which is a more specific selector that's setting to display to flex. So this is never being selected. We put QL snow inside of here. We should now have that being selected. Now we can click print. As you can see, this text right here is identical to the text on our page in here. So we know that we can actually print to this just like you could inside of Google Docs. Now, really the final thing we need to do before we can start working on communicating back to the server and to our client is to get this toolbar looking like we want, because right now our toolbar is pretty limited. So in order to actually configure our toolbar, inside of Quill, we can pass it in some toolbar options. So let's create a variable up here. We're just going to call toolbar options. And there are an absolute ton of different options that you can pass to the toolbar. I'm going to paste some in here real quick, and then I'm going to explain exactly what they all do. So the first thing you do for our toolbar options is make it an array. And then inside that array, you put more arrays of different sections. So each array is like its own section. And as you can see here, we have like our text on the left, which is one section. These 4 things are all one section. Then there's some extra space. These 2 are their own section. Then this final thing is its own section because they have extra space in between them. So we're saying we want headings from 1 all the way up to 6, including normal. So here we have heading 1, 2, 3. We're adding 4, 5, and 6. We want to be able to select different fonts. And you notice this array is empty. That's okay because the theme that we're using has some default fonts it imports in there. We want to be able to have lists, bullet lists, numbered lists, so on. Bold, italic, underlined, different colors and background, again, auto-populated from our theme. We want to be able to do subscript and superscript. We want to align our content left, right, center. We want to be able to import images, block quotes, code blocks, and then finally clean just gets rid of all text formatting completely. So now we have these toolbar options. We can import them into our Quill editor. To do that, there's this modules property. And on the modules property, there is a toolbar property, which we can just set to our toolbar options. Now, if we save this, you can see that we have this much larger toolbar that more similarly looks like the Google Docs toolbar because it has so many more options that you can use for styling needs. And you can add and remove these as you want by looking at the Quill documentation. So now with that done, let's actually move on to our server. So we can just kind of minimize this client for now. We have our server, and inside of our server, let's just navigate to it. We can say /server. That'll navigate us into the server folder, and we can just say npm init-y to create a default package JSON for us. Then we know that we're going to be using socket.io, so let's import socket.io. This is the library that allows us to do WebSocket connections and really easily communicate between different browsers. And now all we need to do is create a server.js file where all of our socket.io code is going to go. So to get started, we can import io, which is coming from the socket.io. This is actually a function, so we need to run this function, and the first thing you pass it is going to be the port where you want to run your code. In our case, we're going to use port 3001. Our actual client is on port 3000, and this is on 3001, and since they are on different ports, essentially our client and our server are on different URLs, we actually need to use cores because that's going to be for cross-origin request support. So we can say cores here, and that will allow us to make requests from a different URL to a different URL over here, since our server and client are in different locations. All we have to do is specify the origin of where our actual client is, which in our case is going to be at localhost port 3000. As you can see here, that's just this URL right here. And then we need to specify what methods we're going to allow to go through. And in our case, we're going to allow get. Let's just make sure that's all capitalized. And we're going to allow post because that's all that socket.io does. It does get request and it does post request. So this right here is going to allow us to do those requests. And then this IO object is going to allow us to actually do our connections. So we can just say io.onConnection. Now, every time our client connects, it's going to run this IO connection right here, and it's going to give us a socket, and this socket is how we communicate back to the client. Now, right now, we can't actually connect to this because our client isn't making a connection, but we can actually do that next. So let me just create a new tab here. We're going to cd into our client, and in here, I just want to install really quickly the client-side version of this. So we can say socket.io/client or -client. This is the client code for this, so we can actually connect from the client to our server. Then inside of our client, let's go back into that text editor here. What we can just do is we can import io. We want to import that from socket.io client. And then we can just make the connection. And we need to make sure we do this in a use effect, since we only want this to run once, like we've talked about before. So let's just come inside of here. We can say use effect. And in this use effect, I want to call io. And I want to call it with the URL we're connecting to. And if you remember, we have our localhost URL, and we set the port to be 3001. That's the port of our server. So this is our server's URL, and on the server side, we put in the client URL. That's the only two things we really need to worry about. And this is going to return to us a socket. So we can say socket is equal to that. And then to make sure we clean this up in our return here, what we can do, make sure this only runs one time, is we can just say that we want to call the disconnect function on our socket to make sure we disconnect it from our server. So we're connecting it right here, and then when we're done with it, we're disconnecting it right here. So this gives us access to an actual socket. And if we go into our server, we can just put a quick console.log here that says connected. And now if we actually run our server by going back to this tab, and let's create a little script for it. Inside of here, we're going to use a script called dev start. And this dev start script is going to call nodemon server.js, just like that. And nodemon is a service we're going to actually install. So we can say npm i-save dev nodemon. And nodemon just allows our server to automatically refresh, kind of the same way that React automatically refreshes. This just does it for our server. We can run npm run dev start. This is going to start up our server for us. And every time we make changes to our server, it's going to automatically refresh. And you can see it already printed out connected. Our client connected to our server, which is great. So now we can actually communicate between our client and our server. So with this, we can actually make sure our communications go between our different clients and our server, so we can actually sync up changes between users. This is where it becomes really like Google Docs, because right now we just have a text editor. We don't have that collaboration feature. So in order to make sure we can access our socket from anywhere, let's put it into state. So we're going to say const socket and set socket is going to be equal to use state. And by default, we're just not going to pass it in anything. We're going to make sure up here we import use state, just like that. Then what we want to do is the same exact thing for our Quill instance. So we're going to say Quill and set Quill, just like that. They're both going to go from state. And here we're just going to say set socket equal to the return of this right here. And then what we need to do is just say, we'll say const s is equal to this, so we don't have two different variables with the same name. We're going to set our socket equal to s. And then in here, we're going to make sure that we do our s.disconnect. So this use effect is just creating our socket for us and disconnecting it when we no longer need it. Then down here, we're going to do the same thing with Quill. We're going to say const q is equal to this. Again, just so we don't have multiple different names. And we're going to say set Quill to q, just like that. So now if I just save this, essentially nothing has changed. We're still able to connect to our server, but we now have the access to our socket and Quill variable. So we can create another use effect. And this use effect is going to be for detecting changes whenever Quill changes. So if we go over to Quill here, what we can do is we can go to the API, and there's these events down here, and you can see there's a text change event. So if we just click on this, it'll bring us down here, and we have a little code example that says, Quill on text change runs this function. It passes us a delta, an old delta, and the source. And really the thing that we care the most about here is our delta. So essentially what we want to do is we want to say quill.on, and we want to do on text change. And we want to make sure that we call some function that takes in a delta, an old delta, and our source. And this source is going to determine whether a user made these changes, whether the actual Quill library made these changes. So it's really important that we make sure we test to make sure a user made these changes. So we're going to say source is not equal to user. Then we're just going to return. We don't want to do anything because we only ever want to track the changes the user makes. Because if I make some changes on my document, then those changes get sent to someone else and they get made on their server or on their client, then the source is going to be something else. It's not going to be user because the changes were made from our API, not our actual user. So we don't want to send changes up to the server to the other clients unless the actual user made those changes. This is just making sure that nothing that we programmatically do is going to be sent to the server. Then what we want to do is actually send these changes to the server. So we can say socket.emit. This allows us to emit a message from our client to our server. We're going to call it send changes. We're going to pass it the delta. And the delta right here is just the thing that is changing. It's not the whole document. It's just a small subset of what is changing in the document. And we're going to send that up to our server. And then we need to make sure in here that we actually remove this event listener if we no longer need it. We'll say quill.off text change. And we also need to pass it the function we want to remove. So let's get this function right here, and we're going to put it into its own variable called handler. We're going to set to that function, and on the text change, we want to run that, and then we want to remove that whenever we are actually cleaning up this. And this relies on our socket and Quill. But when we first run this code, Quill and socket are going to be undefined. So we just want to make sure that socket is not equal to null. So if socket equals null, or if Quill equals null, then we want to return. So essentially all this code does is just checking to make sure we have a socket and a Quill. Then we're setting up an event listener to say whenever Quill has text that changes, we want to send that to our server using this send changes event. So over on our server, what we can do is we can actually listen to that. We can say socket.on send changes. We want to run some code. And remember, we're getting that delta passed in. And for now, I'm just going to console log out the delta to see what we're working with. We'll get rid of this connected here. So if we go over here and we just start typing in some code, you're going to notice all these changes are being sent to us. And as you can see, it's saying, insert the letter S, and it's saying do it in this location. If I copy a bunch of code and paste it, it's now saying, insert this text as some attributes along with it in this location. This is the big reason I chose Quill, because it allows us to do these small little operations one at a time instead of copy pasting the whole document every time a change is made. So now instead of logging that, let's actually send that. We can say socket.broadcast.emit. And in emit, we actually pass it the function name. So we're going to say receive changes, because that's what's going to be on the client. And we're just going to pass in the delta, which is those changes. And all that this code does right here is it's saying, okay, on our current socket, we want to broadcast a message to everyone else except for us that there are some changes that they should receive. And here are those changes. So then we can go back into our text editor and we can set up another use effect that's going to look very, very similar to this. I'm actually going to copy this completely, And our handler here is going to be for receiving that event. So instead of doing this with Quill, we're going to say socket.on receive changes. And this is the event that we set up on our server. And we have a handler that's going to take in the delta that we get from our receive changes. Now, all we need to do inside of here is just say quill.update contents with our changes. And what this is going to do is it's going to run these changes, in our case we called them delta, on our code to actually make it actually do those changes for us. And then down here, let's just make sure we have socket off of receive changes, just like that. Make sure I spell changes correctly. So all we're doing is the exact same thing, setting up an event listener. This one is just updating our document to have the changes that are being passed from our other client. So now if we actually get two versions of this running at the same time, so I get a second version of localhost, I'm going to bring it down off to the side, this one up here. And now if we just type in some text, you can see it's actually propagating to both of our different text editors at the same time. And I'm not controlling them both at the same time. They're being controlled completely separately from one another. This is like two different computers essentially. But our server is doing all of the communication between the two objects to make sure that it works exactly as we want. So right now we have a pretty good base point for our Google Docs clone, but when we refresh, obviously none of our changes are being saved. And also everyone is modifying the exact same document. They're all on localhost 3000. We need to be able to fix that so that we can have multiple different documents. So in order to do that, we're going to be using React Router. So if I come over here, we can install some packages. Just make sure this is the right folder, and it is. So we can just say inside of here, npm I React Router. This is going to install React Router, which allows us to route to different routes. And really, we only care about a couple routes. So in our app.js, let's actually set this up. In order to use React Router, we need to come in here and import quite a few different things. We need to import a browser router. We're just going to rename that to router to make it easier to work with. We also need a switch. We need a route. And we're also, in our case, going to need a redirect. And this is all going to be coming from React Router DOM. And that reminds me, we actually need to make sure we install React Router DOM instead of React Router. That way we have the correct version of it for the actual DOM. And instead of our package JSON, let's just remove React Router since we don't actually need that. There we go. And we can just run our npm I one last time to make sure that's all cleaned up. Now we actually have React Router DOM, which is what we wanted. And inside of here, we have access to all of these different components. In order to use a router, all we need to do is just wrap everything inside of a router. So we're going to say router, and we're going to wrap everything inside of this router, just like this. And in that router, we need to set up a switch. And this is actually what determines our different routes. So inside of a switch, we can think about it as like a normal switch statement inside of JavaScript. And each route is a case on our switch statement. So this route is going to be for our path, which is this local host path, just the root path. And the interesting thing about React Router is it matches everything that matches this slash path. So it'll match the homepage, it'll match slash this, it'll match literally anything at all. We want to make sure it matches only exactly the homepage. We're just going to pass in the text exact right here, and this will just make sure it only matches exactly the home route and nothing else. And inside of here, we put all the code we want to run when we're on the home page. We're also going to create a second route, and this route is going to be for matching the path of documents / any ID at all that we want. If we put colon and then some variable, that'll be like a variable that can change, so it can be any ID at all. And this doesn't need to be exact. When we have this instance, we want to actually render out our text editor. So let's put our text editor inside of there. And when we render the homepage route, we just want to redirect them to a random document. So we're going to say redirect to, and we want to redirect them to a brand new document. So we can say documents, let's make this /documents/, and we need to generate here a unique ID. And an easy way to do that is going to be using UUID, and we're going to use v4. So let's make sure we install that UUID package, which is just called UUID. And up here, we can import, we want to get v4 as UUID v4, just renaming it here from the UUID library. And now we're essentially generating a completely random document we're going to redirect people to immediately. And then when we redirect them, we're going to render out the text editor. So if we save this and just refresh over here, you're going to notice we redirected to a random document. This user down here got redirected to a completely different random document. But if I wanted, I could put them on the exact same document, just like that. So now they both have the same URL, which means they should be modifying the exact same document. Now, unfortunately, just because they have the same URL, it doesn't mean that Socket.io is going to work just fine for them. Because, for example, if I take this user, I'm going to redirect them to a new URL. These are on different URLs. They have different IDs. But when I change one, it still changes the other. In order to fix this, we need to set our socket.io users into their own rooms. So each user is going to be in a room based on the ID in their URL. And in order to do that, we're just going to do some really simple code that's going to call up to the server saying that they're ready to get to the document, and that's going to put them into this room for them. So in our text editor here, let's create another use effect. And again, this use effect is going to be fairly similar to what we've been working with before. We're just going to say use effect. This use effect is going to depend on our socket here. So we're just going to say socket. It's also going to depend on Quill, and we also want to get the document ID, just like this. So to get the document ID, we need to use something from React Router, and this thing is called use params. And we're going to get that from React Router DOM. And what we can do is we can just say const params is equal to use params. And this params contains our ID object, and we just want to redirect this name, essentially rename it as document ID. So this ID is the same thing that is named right here, this ID right here. That's why they have the same name, and we're just renaming it to document ID. So now we have access to the document ID, and just to see how this works, we can just do a quick console log of our document ID. And if I just inspect the page here, go to the console, you can see it printed out that ID right here. So we have access to the ID from our URL. Then what happens is every time that our socket, Quill, or document ID changes, we want to run this code. First, we want to make sure that our socket is not equal to null, and we want to make sure, actually we're going to check if it is equal to null, or if Quill is equal to null, then we just want to return immediately. Don't execute this code. Otherwise, we want to tell the server what document we're actually a part of. So we can say socket.emit, and we're just going to emit get document, and we're going to pass it our document ID. So what this is going to do is it's going to send up to the server our document ID so we can actually attach ourselves to the room for that document. And if we have a document saved, it's going to send us that document back to us. Then what we want to do is make sure we listen to that event. So we can just say on, or in our case, since we only ever want to listen to this event once, we can say once. And this will automatically clean up the event after it gets listened to once. So we can say load document. And we want to load a document, and it's going to take in the document. So when we call get document, it's going to pass up to our server our document. Our server is going to do some stuff behind the scenes to load our document, and it's going to send it back down to our client with this load document event. And then all we can do is say quill.set contents equal to our document, so we can actually load up our text editor to have this content inside of it. And we can say quill.enable. And that's because I want to disable our text editor until our document is loaded. So down here where we're actually setting up Quill, I just want to come in here and say quill.enable false, and I want to say q.setText. I'm going to set it to the text of loading with some dots afterward like this. And instead of using enable, I'm just going to use the disable function, a little bit more straightforward what's going on. Now what happens is by default we have this loading text, and I actually can't type in here because right now it's disabled. And that's because if we just go up here real quick, we're not actually getting this load document event from our server. So let's actually make sure we create that load document inside of here. We can say socket.on get document. That is the event that we are sending up here. If I just open this back up again, you can see we're sending our get document, and we know that this is going to take in a document ID. Now, the first thing this is going to do is actually load up the data. For now, we're not going to worry about this too much. We're just going to say that our data is equal to an empty string, and we're not going to really care about loading it from this document ID, at least not yet. Then the next thing that we want to do is make sure that this socket joins a room for that document ID. So when you call join, you're essentially putting this server, or this client, this socket into its own room, and everyone else in that room can talk based on this room ID, which in our case is the same as our document ID. That way down here, when we emit something, we can emit it to, we can use this to function to emit it to our document ID. So if we just move this entire thing up like this, now what's happening is we can send our changes to a specific room whenever we broadcast them. Also, we want to make sure that our socket is going to emit out the correct data. So it's going to say load document, and we want to pass in our data, which in our case is just an empty string for now. So now if we save these changes, and I just refresh over here, you'll notice that immediately I can start typing inside of here, and that's because it called the get document, it joined this room, and it loaded up the document with our data. Now the next thing I want to do is make sure that this works when I communicate back and forth. So right now we are in two different rooms. So if I make changes in this top room, you notice they're not being sent to the bottom room. If I make changes in the bottom room, they're not being sent to the top room. But if I put both of these users in the exact same room, And if I make changes up here, you'll notice they're being propagated down to the bottom. And that's just because these users are now connected because they're in the exact same room. But as soon as they get put in different rooms, the changes are no longer propagated. One issue, though, that you may have run into yourself is that unless your documents are exactly the same when you start, you're going to have some weird issues. And that is where our actual loading of our document is going to come really handy. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to go to our server. Let's just exit it out for now. We want to install a library called Mongoose, and this is going to allow us to really easily interact with a MongoDB database. So you need to make sure you have MongoDB installed, and if you don't, I have a video on it I'll put up in the cards and description for you so you can check it out. But what we need to do is actually use Mongoose. So we can say const mongoose is equal to requiring that Mongoose library, just like that. And in order to connect with Mongoose, we just go over to the documentation. You can see we have code right here for Mongoose connection. We can just paste that in. And essentially we're connecting to a database, which we're going to call Google Docs clone. You can call it whatever you want. And these settings here are just for backwards compatibility. So just make sure whatever settings are in the docs at the time that you actually watch this video, you put in here. They don't have to be the same as mine. Just follow whatever the documentation says. And we don't need to worry about this await keyword because it'll actually make sure we're connected before any database stuff gets fired. So this is going to do our connection for us. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually create a schema. So we're going to create a brand new file called document.js. And this document.js is going to contain all of our data for our document inside of our database. So we're going to make sure we get schema. And we need to get a model from that Mongoose library. And in order to set up a schema, we can just say const document equals new schema. And this schema is just essentially dictating what's in our object. So we're going to have an ID property, which is a string, and we're going to have a data property, which is just an object. And this data right here is just going to be whatever Quill sends us. It's going to have a bunch of data that corresponds with how it writes out our document. We don't really care what it is. We just care that it's in this data property. And that's all that our document is. It's just an ID linking to some data. Then we can come in here and we can actually export that. But we need to make sure we export it as a model. So we're going to call model, and we're going to pass it in the name of the model, which in our case is document. That's whatever we want to call it. And we pass it in our schema, which is also called document. Now we have a document inside of our database. We have that ability to store that kind of information. Now if we go back into our server, let's make sure we have our document by requiring it in here. So we get /document, just like that. And now we can actually find documents. So what I want to do is whenever I get a document here, I want to either find the document or create it from scratch. So I'm going to create a function to do that called find or create document, and it's going to take in an ID. And all we're going to do is if the ID is null, so for some reason we don't have an ID, I just want it to return immediately. Just a little bit of fail-safe right there. Then what I want to do is I want to say document equals, and I want to await trying to find the document. So we can say find by ID and pass it in our ID. And since we're using async await, let's make sure this is an async function. Then if we have a document, obviously just return the document to the user, pretty straightforward. Otherwise, if we don't, we want to return the creation of a new document. So we can say document.create. And we know that we have an ID, which is our ID property, and we have data, which we're going to pass in our default value. So let's just create a default value up here. And this default value is simply just going to be an empty string, just like that. Make sure I spell const properly. There we go. So by default, if we don't have a document, we're going to create one with that ID, and it's just going to have an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to find or create a document. So let's come up here, and instead, we're going to say find or create our document with our document ID. And instead of data, this is going to be a document. And then we just want to return our document.data right here. So this is going to be great for loading our document. But the final thing we have left to do is save our document. So we can just say socket.on, and we want to do a save document. And this is going to be an async function. And it's going to take in the entire document that we want to save. This is all of our data, essentially. So we're going to call this our data. And up here, also, we need to make sure this is an async function because we need to make sure we await finding our document right here. So now when we save our document, again, we're going to do an await of document, and we want to do a find by ID and update. So we're going to find the document that exists and update it. So we already have our document ID, and I just want to update our data to be the data that we're passing in right here. That's it. We're just updating the data of our document, pretty straightforward, and that's what our save is going to do. And this is something we can call from our client. So let's go back to our client and let's set up yet another use effect to do that saving for us. Use effect And this use effect is obviously going to depend on socket and quill, just like all of our other use effects are. So we have socket quill, and let's also make sure that we check to make sure they exist. So I'm just going to copy that down. So if socket equals null or quill equals null, obviously return. And all we want to do is here is set up a timer. Every, couple of seconds, we're going to save our document. So we're going to create an interval, which is just equal to set interval. And this just creates a timer that runs a function every so many seconds. And here we pass it how many milliseconds we want to wait. So I'm going to create a variable called save interval ms to stand for save interval milliseconds. And up here, I'm just going to say that variable is equal to 2000. So every 2 seconds, we're going to save our document. You can tweak this however much you want. This just seems like a decently reasonable number. So now inside of here, our interval, we're going to take our socket, we're going to emit that save document function. And in order to get the actual contents of our document, we can say quill.get contents. That's it. That's going to give us all the information we need to save to our database. And then we just want to make sure in our return that we are clearing out this interval so we don't have it running anymore. So clear interval of that interval. So now if we minimize this out, we can go over to our document right here, click a little refresh here, and it doesn't look like things are loading. So it looks like we probably have some errors. Let's inspect, go to our console. It's saying it's unable to connect, and that's because our server is not running. Let's make sure that we actually run our server. And now you can see, if we just refresh everything, that they are properly connecting. Down here, we're still getting errors, it looks like. Let's just inspect to see what those are. It doesn't look like there are any errors, but you can see this loading text is actually saved to our document. We don't really want that, so now as you can see, we don't have that text. But if I change something up here, you can see it's changing it everywhere. Let's bold this text. Bold it from up here. As you can see, it bolds in both locations. Over here, we're going to do it in italics. You can see it's italics over here. And the best part is, if we just wait a couple seconds, click refresh, all of that data is being stored inside of our database. And that's what that save document function is doing. And if for some reason I have 2 different documents going, as you can see, this document is separate from this document. They're both completely independent and not affecting one another. But as I refresh, you can see both of these are also still being saved. And if I were to go back to this URL that I was at before, you can see it just loaded up the document as it is. And that's all it takes to build this full Google Docs clone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other clone-based videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.